gorgeous. I love it.
Welcome to Specific Love. Here recently I made an end table for my mom and she absolutely loved it. But she asked if I could make another one. But in this case, a little bit different. She wants this one to be round and smaller, but about the same height. So, let's do this. Now I could go about setting up a jig, maybe build it on the table saw or the bandsaw, but then I thought, wait a minute, I have a CNC machine. Let's give that a try. Now when it comes to a CNC machine, I'm still learning. I don't want to act like I know everything about it because I don't. So I want to start somewhere that I do know. So I first went to a program I did know, which is SketchUp. And I drew out a rough design of what this table is going to look like. Now of course you don't have to have SketchUp, you can hand draw this out. It's just the fastest for me. I then went over to VCarve and drew everything out one more time so I know exactly where it's going to be cut. And once I have everything set up, I'm going to be cutting this on my Stepcraft M1000. Now my wood of choice is going to be maple plywood because it's nice and hardy and I already had it on hand. I'm also using some MDF as a spoil board so I don't cut it into my table. And to make these cuts, I'm going to be using an 1/8 inch spiral fishtail bit. Now using a small bit like this means a lot of the corners are going to be nice and tight and sharp, but it also means that it's going to take a while. So if you're going to use a CNC machine in your future, make sure you know that if you use a small bit, it's going to take a little bit to cut it out. Now normally when we're using a CNC, you would have a little dust boot that keeps all the debris and wood chips all in one area so you can have a vacuum hooked up and suck it all off. But in this case, I'm going to leave it off so you can see the bit cutting. Now I've set up these cuts into 3 different segments. That way if there's any kind of problem, I can stop on one and always rearrange and cut it again. Now, we're going to first start by cutting off the top along with the W. Now this W has a little bit of fur on the edge, but that's okay. We'll take care of that with some sanding. But otherwise, this top and the W came out fantastic. Now we're going to cut out the rest of the circles. And now with 4 circles cut, we're ready to move on to the legs. But there is something you need to remember. Always keep track of where your clamps are in relation to where your cuts will be. For example, I had to move this one a couple times, and if you see here, if I hadn't, it would have come in contact and possibly broken the bit or just messed up this clamp. In any case, be careful with these. And if you're new to CNC machines like I am, this is why we have a spoil board so we don't cut into the top of the table. Now I get to cut out all these little tabs that are holding them in place so I can free up all the pieces. Now it's time to cut these tabs out. I'm going to be using a hacksaw blade because it is really thin. Now I have the tabs on the bottom, so I'm going to be cutting in an upward fashion so that I'm cutting toward the center of the board. That way there's less chance of any kind of blowout on your pieces and messing them up. Let's see, yep, that's a sharp side, so definitely. This might take a little bit, so, well, just prepare yourself. Now we gotta sand all these ugly little tabs down flush with the outside profile. Now I did a temporary assemble here just to kind of make sure everything looks the way I want it, and I'm pretty pleased with it. There are a few exceptions, of course. We're dealing with a round shelf going into a square cut here, and so I can make it look a little worse right there for you. It's going to be a little bit of a gap in every single corner. But the way we're going to finish this, those won't be as noticeable. Now when I was test fitting all these together and putting these in the little slots, well, I noticed that the slots in here, because it's done on a CNC, is not going to be perfectly square. It's really close, but there's still just a slight round over in each of these corners. And when you're trying to put something that is squared off into those corners, it's not a perfect fit. Now to help reduce some of that, I'm going to take a palm router with an 1/8 inch round over bit. We're going to go over just the 3 shelves, not the top one, and go over all these edges just to kind of give them a very slight round over so they'll fit even better. Now before I start applying finish to the table, I want to test it on some of this scrap wood that was left over from the cuts. So I'm actually going to cut this off right about here and then test it with this. Now I got some thin pieces here that'll work for testing out the legs and some larger pieces that'll test out for the shelves. And I actually took one and cut some curves in it on the bandsaw. Nothing major, but just enough so I can see how it's going to react with the sides. And now it's time to add a little fire. Now, kind of as I expected, the fire didn't exactly bring out the grain that I was really hoping it would. It does a lot better in pine. You can probably see right there on that little sawhorse that it brings the grain out a lot more than it does on this like a maple veneer. Now, in any case, I think I'm going to try and do this with a stain. Now, with the legs here, or at least the test part for the legs, it came out a little bit better. The thing about the fire I'm noticing is that it's a lot harder to control to get a nice even burn across everything, so I'm probably going to stain this as well. Now since the pieces we burned didn't work out, I'm actually going to try and stain these. Now I got a dark walnut and an early American stain, and I'm going to try and stain the opposite side of these and see how they come out. Now as you can see here, this is the dark walnut and here's the early American. The dark walnut definitely looks a little bit more like a burn, so I'm probably going to go with this, but I need to test it on a bigger scale. Now I was looking around my shop and I found an old stain that's called Jacobine. It's a lot darker than the dark walnut, as you can see here. And I tested it out on what would be the shelves and on the legs. On the legs here, I like how the contrast between the layers definitely pops a lot more with the Jacobine versus the dark walnut. But I'm not so sure if I want this dark for the shelves. Now for the shelves, I'm going to settle on this aged wood accelerator. This gives it a rustic brown look. And I applied it to this piece here. It might be a little bit hard to see on camera, but in certain angles you can see the grain, and then at other angles you cannot. And then from the top sometimes you can get it to almost glisten, like there's almost like a particles of metal flake in the top there. Now it is definitely a little bit lighter than the original dark walnut I was going to go with, but I think this will be a nice contrast with the legs. Now when I'm applying this stain to the smaller shelves, it's no big deal. I just wipe it on, wipe it off. But when I'm starting to apply it to this top piece, I gotta make sure it's a very, very thin layer that's actually on this rag, because I need to make sure I can go around all these edges here without getting any stain down in these grooves, because I have another plan for that. Now for the top shelf, I'm actually gonna start on the back, because I just feel a little more comfortable doing that. And then we'll flip it over and get the top. And now that I think about it, I don't really need the bottom because most of this is going to be covered. So I at least need to make sure this outer edge here is fully sealed. So we'll do like so. And actually we'll get the outer ring next, making sure I don't stick my fingers in these grooves. Alright, now for the moment of truth. I do need a little bit more on here, but I don't want to do much. I'm just going to dip a little tiny bit and kind of squeeze it out across the rag here because I can't take a chance of it dripping. And then very carefully I start applying this. Now while I'm giving some time for the stain to dry, I've been doing some testing on the best way to assemble this. This is just the scraps left over, and I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a little bit of glue on the corner there, slide in the shelf, and then just take a brad nail and put it in, hold it in place, and possibly clamp it while I'm waiting. Now, if you can see there, that's just a brad nail. It's holding nice and tight with that scrap right there, so this should work out pretty well. Now here's a little learning lesson for myself, and I hope you can take away something from my mistakes. So, the stain I applied to the shelves is water-based, and it is nearly, if not already, dry. And so I reached over and grabbed one of the legs and noticed it seemed like it was still a little bit damp. So I did a little checking and I found out it is oil-based. Oops. So it's going to take a little bit longer to dry than planned. And as I plan to apply a lacquer or a polyurethane over the top of this, I need to give this even longer to dry so that it fully adheres to it. Now it is possible to use a oil-based stain and a water-based like outer coating like polyurethane, but you need to make sure that it is fully cured. In other words, they recommend 72 hours, so say at least 3, maybe 4 days to make sure this is fully dry before you add that water-based protectant cover. Otherwise, there's a very good chance that this would not adhere very well and cause problems. Now my original plan was to next assemble everything, and then I was going to apply some epoxy on the W and just the tabletop in general. But now that I have to wait a few days for the oil-based stain, to dry, I'm now going to apply the epoxy first, and that should allow me to get to everything easily, and if I have to do any sanding, especially on the bottom, should be a lot easier to get to now. Now for the top of this table, I'm going to be using Total Boat tabletop epoxy. Try and say that 3 times fast. Now, here recently my wife actually got some epoxy poisoning, and I did a video of that on my second channel. If you don't know about that, I'll have a link to the description. It's called The Little Wood House. It was not Total Boat, it was a different brand. And so we're a little partial for Total Boat. But in any case, when you're using epoxy, make sure you wear gloves, you need a respirator, plenty of ventilation so you can avoid any kind of symptomatic and any kind of issues from it. And always make sure your workpiece is nice and level and sturdy so you don't have any high and low spots in the epoxy. Now as you're working with the epoxy here, this is self-leveling, but sometimes we have to direct it to go exactly where we want it to go. For example, I'm trying to bring it out to the edge here, but just work with it and do the best you can. Now that I got it fully across the whole tabletop, I actually want it to go along the edge here, so I'm gonna use my finger just to kind of pull it off the edge and try and go in there, and if that doesn't work, we'll use a brush. Just keep in mind that this means it's probably going to pour over the edge and we'll have to clean this up later. Now if you're giving it a few days, this looks awesome. Now there are a few things about it that could be improved. For example, if you look real hard, you won't probably be able to see it in camera. There's a few bubbles here and a few small bubbles here. They're real small, so if you're up here close to it like this, you'll see them. But at arm's length, or which most people will see this project, you can't see them. It looks great. And the reason why I believe is the layer that was below this top layer wasn't fully sealed, and therefore it still had a little bit of air coming through, and that would probably be the main reason. So this looks awesome. Let's go check on the legs. Now it's been about 72 hours and these feel pretty much dry. I'm not used to using an oil-based finish, so this extra almost like a smooth texture to it is a little bit odd for me. I usually use the water-based because of how quick everything dries, but I like how this is coming out. Now let's go see if we can put this together. Now once everything has had time to dry, it's a good idea to go back and recheck and make sure that the shelves, especially the tops of the shelves that you originally wanted, are the ones you still want, because they can change a little bit with the stain, especially the outline of all the grain that's going on. So I believe I'm going to make these two the tops, one for the bottom shelf and one for the middle shelf. But I still have this one piece left, and that's actually going to go onto the bottom of the top to give it more strength and to give it some place for the legs to actually adhere to. And the great thing about that is this piece, you can see right there, actually has a really large knot in it. That's okay, it'll never be seen. Now here comes one of the more challenging parts about this build. That is actually finding 4 corners on a circle. Do circles have corners? I mean, technically, no, they don't. But if you're very, very careful, you can figure out 4 exact opposite areas that will somewhat work out for you. In my case here, I actually found a box that I had coming in from a previous tool I bought that's almost perfect for this size. So all I'm gonna do is line everything up best I can on here and mark what about should be 4 corners on a circle. If you don't have this, you can always maybe get a square, some measuring tapes, and just very, very carefully measure everything out, and you can still find 4 corners on your circle. And once you have the first one marked, use it as a template for the others. Now to hold all this together, I'm going to be using some dark wood glue by Type Bond. Now this is great for anything that have dark woods naturally, or in my case it's stained. That way if this squeezes out just a little bit, hopefully it won't be as noticeable. Now putting this clamp on, I'm not putting it on very tight. I just want it to be able to hold together without moving around. So we're just putting a little bit of pressure, not much. And then we're going to carefully pry these apart just a little bit, making sure not to separate the bottom we just did, and insert this second shelf. Now while we're assembling all this, it's probably a good idea to take the other 2 legs and just put them in place. We're not putting any glue on them at the moment. We're just trying to make sure everything is still in alignment with the first 2 legs. And it appears to be everything is still nice and straight. Now we can add the 3rd circle. Now before the glue has time to dry, I'm going to go back with a corner square and a level. We're going to make sure everything on here is nice and as straight as possible. And then we're going to put a brad nail in through each leg into each shelf. Now that we have the first 2 legs glued, nailed, and clamped back in place to make sure the glue dries properly, we are going to take off each of the other 2 legs individually, add some glue, and do the same. Now that I've given some time for this frame to dry, I want to attach the top circle here, just the one with the W, on top of the top circle that's connected to the frame. And to do that, I've tested out and measured each of these corners and make sure it is close as possible to being even on 4 sides. And then we're going to take a pencil, trace that out, take it off, add some glue, and clamp it back on. And we're going to use the same dark wood glue. The alignment marks also make a great barrier to know exactly where not to put the glue. Now that I have the main tabletop in place and I have the glue sandwiched in between these 2 pieces of wood, I need to clamp them together. But because this is epoxy, I don't want to clamp directly to it. So I'm taking a cotton t-shirt and then another piece of wood on top of that. Then I'm going to gently clamp these together and that should work. Now while the top is drying, I'm going to be adding a polyurethane on the other shelves and the legs because we want it to have a nice glossy texture, but also we want to protect it just in case anything ever gets spilled on it. And here is the finished product. This table turned out looking awesome. And the great thing about this is you do not have to have the CNC to make this. Yes, I made this on mine, but you could easily go cut the legs out for the table saw, do some dados and some rabbets to make those cuts. Then you could set up a jig on maybe your table saw or even your band saw or something along those lines to cut out the circles as well. So just keep in mind this is actually a pretty simple build, but I used the CNC because I just wanted to try something new. Now, Mom, I really hope you like this. And to all of y'all, get out and shop and have fun building. Round? No, a little bit round. Let's try it. Why it seemed like that blah, 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 blah. Let's try it one more time. Head and go. Needs to be. I can't say it. Some corner bracket. Corner squares. All right, try it again. And it feels. Let's try it again. Let's try it again. An alignment. Let's try it again. All right. Everything on the rest of the table. And the legs and the shelf. All right. I can't talk.